The rise of Donald Trump and populist politicians elsewhere is directly threatening women's rights across the globe. Joining me now is Professor Anne Marie Goetz, a former advisor to UN Women and now professor at the Centre for Global Affairs at New York University. Professor Goetz, thank you very much for joining us. Just how dangerous is Donald Trump when it comes to women's rights in America?
Extremely dangerous, because the rollback of women's rights is foundational to the agenda of this administration. But I think it's important to say, it's not just Donald Trump that's the problem. He's an opportunist, he's a sheer opportunist. There are people in his administration who are dedicated, in fact, to the rollback of women's rights. Even before they took office, his transition team, which was otherwise highly disorganized, took the trouble of writing to the State Department to ask who was working on women's rights and what exactly was the State Department doing on women's rights and how much money was being spent on it. So that clearly indicated a concern about this area and a desire to actually start attacking it, which was among the first actions of the Trump administration.
So are we witnessing a resurgence in misogyny across this country?
There's no question that there is more permission for misogyny that's been given by significant political leaders like Trump. And this is something which is consistent across a number of new ethno-nationalist populist groups around the world. There is an attack on women's rights. And this is based partly in a fear about gender, actually, about gender difference, about sexual orientation, about the idea that there could be more than two genders. This triggers very serious reactions amongst people who feel that their kind of worldview is being shaken. But obviously, there's been a resurgence in misogyny around the world. What's so striking is that this has been considered for so long to be inappropriate, unacceptable, anti-modern. And what Trump's campaign did is he labeled this kind of misogyny as political correctness, thereby undermining the fact that it's actually got devastating, in fact, life-threatening implications.
But a sizable chunk of white women actually voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's true. Apparently 53% of white women voted for Trump. 54% of all women voted for Hillary Clinton, so she still won more women's votes than he did overall. But that statistic, the 53%, is very worrying. It's very confusing. It's baffling. It is part of sort of not any more latent misogyny in this country, a profound religious conservatism, especially in the center of this country. It's part of that, and it's also part of a fear by working class and middle class people, a fear of change, a fear of their loss of economic security, and so on.
But it appears, if anything, that Donald Trump has in fact given new life to the women's movement.
There is no doubt that the Trump phenomenon, as well as the rise of these kinds of misogynist strongmen leaders around the world, has certainly reinvigorated feminist resistance and feminist movements. So yes, there has been a resurgence. I would also say that this has been a very important moment of reckoning for the women's movement here in the US and around the world. How inclusive are we? There are perennial problems with including racial minorities, sexual minorities, but we also have to ask, how is it that 53% of white women found Trump's message more appealing than a message of equality and justice?
With the political spectrum across the world seeming to swing to the far right, and certainly with the popularity of Donald Trump here in America, you've written that the time has come for the UN to step up to the plate and fight for gender equality. Are they capable of doing that?
It's a good question. The UN has to spearhead a global feminist surge. The new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has so far, he's still in his first 100 days, has so far put women's rights at the top of his agenda. But you asked, is the UN capable of doing that? And the UN's capability on promoting women's rights is going to be damaged significantly if the Trump administration carries through on its threats of cutting funding. Internationally, the US is a very important leader in negotiating agreements and treaties on women's rights. It always has been from the foundation of the UN. It's always played a major role. Yes, there is the global gag rule and the Helms Amendment, which the US, allows the US not to support abortion services or even talk about abortion. And that, of course, has been strengthened and expanded, which is extremely dangerous. But in negotiations on women's rights, the US used to be relied on to defend women's rights. Now, I'm not sure that's going to be the case, and that could be very damaging.
Professor Goetz, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.